Thanks for tuning in to the Medevac podcast, powered by the Robert Irvine Foundation, whose mission is to support and strengthen the physical and mental well-being of our nation's heroes and their families. I'm one of your hosts, David Reid.
And I'm your other host, Christian Meyers. Thank you very much for joining us today on the Medevac podcast. If you are new here, there's a price for the show. You have to share it with a friend or family member if you're getting that something out of today's episode. We have a fantastic guest today, a very interesting conversation we're about to have. Please welcome to the show Brooke Fina. She is a licensed social worker, as well as the training assistance manager with Face the Fight. Face the Fight is a wonderful organization who is trying to curb veteran suicide through education and training. So thank you very much for joining us today, Brooke.
Thanks for being here, Brooke.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we hear this is your first podcast ever.
Uh-oh.
That is true.
So we're going to go easy on you today. Don't worry. But it's an interesting subject. I think we love the mental health aspect of things. Coming out here, education is probably the biggest thing we could do. What I love about Face the Fight, and we had Bob Yarnell on a few weeks ago, is that we're kind of breaking the stigma down, and we're educating people through alternative means on preventing suicide. So let's rewind that a little bit and talk about kind of how you got here, what your background is, and what the military really means to you.
Thanks so much. So I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I started that portion of my career at Fort Cavazos, then was Fort Hood. And I worked with, and still do work with, a group called Strong Star, which is a large research consortium dedicated to learning and testing treatments that work for active duty and veteran PTSD and suicide and related conditions.
Okay.
And so in that role, I had the privilege and the opportunity to work with and treat many service members at the time through that research. And that was really important to me. You know, I wanted to give back in the small way that I could. And in that role, because it was research, I got a lot of really good training. Really good training in treatments we know that work. We call them evidence-based treatments for PTSD, for suicide, and got to work with the treatment developers in these capacities. And, you know, a couple years into that, it was really important getting this data and understanding what works so that can be disseminated. But there's also a challenge in that. Like, how do you get this out to other clinicians in the field? Mm-hmm. And clinicians who don't work in big systems like DOD or VA.
Sure.
And so myself and a colleague really felt that charge and developed a national training program called the Strong Star Training Initiative. We're grant funded, started here in Texas and scaled nationally. And the aim really has been to train clinicians in these treatments that we know that work. And so that was a lot of the work. And then about 2 years ago, when we had the privilege of starting to work with Face the Fight, really thinking about expanding those interventions and tools that we work into non-clinical community settings.
Mm-hmm. Now with Strong Star?
Yeah.
What are some of the modalities that you guys are teaching and looking into? Because obviously, the last couple of years, there's been a lot of alternative modalities lumped into traditional methods. So I'm curious the types of things that you guys were looking into and researching and have vetted at least.
Yeah. So, 10 plus years ago, where we started was testing treatments like prolonged exposure therapy for PTSD, cognitive processing therapy, written exposure therapy. And these are the treatments that at our training initiative, where we focus on training clinicians, that we still train in today.
So I want to talk about nomenclature as well. I know that in kind of an ever-evolving world, things are speeding up quite a bit, and things like committed suicide, right? These kind of words. This is kind of where I'm going with that. What are some of the updated words? I heard you say wicked earlier, and it's not just a New England thing. This is terminology, right? What are some of these kind of new words?
Yeah, so
things to look for.
Thanks for that. I think it is really important, the nomenclature and the way we talk about suicide risk and suicide prevention. We really try not to use terminology like committed suicide or, took one's life. I think that using those terms, and I think the field would agree with me, can be tricky, can be pejorative at times, and it's hard because we're used to saying those things. That's the way we've talked about suicide for a long time. But similar to how you would say, my friend died of cancer, we want to really think about taking the stigma out and saying things like that person died by suicide.
Yeah.
And that's really important. Wicked, which I know we were talking about before we started recording, is a way to conceptualize the problem of suicide in the country and with veterans in the veteran community too. It's been a term that's been used by researchers and theorists to describe really complex problems, problems that don't have one reason or one solution, like suicide.
Sure.
And so I really like that term because I think it quickly helps you to think about, how challenging the problem of veteran suicide prevention can be and how complex it is.
Sure.
And that can drive change. What do we need to do? All in, like, let's get our feet wet, everyone, to try to solve this wicked problem.
I like that. Going back to the nomenclature piece, so the committed suicide as a term, it has a legal basis. That's where it stems from, I think, right? Because you are committing a homicide of the self, and that's where I think it's based in a legal terminology, is my understanding of it.
I actually don't know the history of it.
That's my understanding, because you are
know.
committing a homicide by doing that in a legal definition, which is, I think, where the term stems from. And
yes, crime.
Yeah, because it is a crime. It is a crime to do that, which I think that's where the term stems from. I'm curious what the replacement of those words, what effect does that have on people's perception of it, or people who are, I guess, I don't want to say surrounded by it, but involved and somewhat surrounded by it. The veteran community is more or less surrounded by suicide, and I'm curious what changing the definition or changing the verbiage does to curb that, or does it make it softer? Does it make it easier to approach? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. I mean, my hope is that it helps to reduce stigma. And that if we can reduce stigma by saying, this is a fact, this person died by suicide, then hopefully that can help open up the conversation.
To talk about it?
To talk about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Also to think about post-vention resources for survivors of suicide loss.
Sure.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. Is committed is very harsh. It's doing something wrong. It's connotated with that definition of just doing something wrong. So when you say died by, it more implements the pain that I think behind that as well. So with the pain and all these guys are feeling, I'm curious. You had numerous hours in clinical work, right? You said, do you have background in correlation with different modalities, such as how TBI affects suicide, or suicidal ideations, I suppose? Do we have an idea? We have an idea and a correlation of post-traumatic stress, and now with countless research, the correlation between traumatic brain injuries and PTS is very, very married together. So can we say that physical damage of the brain, if we attack that problem, maybe it has an effect on suicidal ideation as well?
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with that line of research, but it makes a ton of sense, right?
The symptoms are overlapping.
For sure, the overlapping symptoms, the impacts. And if we go back to this idea of it being a wicked problem, right? There are kind of psychological factors, damage to the brain as a factor, right? Other factors, there's environmental factors, there's social factors. There's so many factors that go in to the unique makeup of why someone might be at risk and, tragically might die by suicide.
Sure.
I think herein lies, I don't want to say problem, but maybe something that needs to be bridged more, right? Is we talk about this all the time in the show, and we've talked to hundreds of people about subject matter experts from various fields, and the biggest thing that I've noticed is a lack of communication between those fields. And let me kind of expound on this. Is traumatic. We talk about different modalities when it comes to like transcranial magnetic stimulation. How that affects the physicality of the brain and the neural pathways. And then you have, cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness training, right? Those guys don't talk. They say, my therapy is the best. And really what I think we need to see is a communication and say, hey, maybe it's a staged approach. It's on a gradation of making a change in the beginning, right? Yeah. Can we put a program together where we have different, organizations and say, hey, this is plan A, B, C, and D to get you to that end state.
I think you make a really important point for all those clinicians and researchers listening.
Talk to each other.
We're talking to you out there.
Talk to each other.
But I think there's a couple factors that might contribute, and maybe we're at a critical time point where that can start to happen. As a field, suicide prevention research, thinking about the clinical interventions that are most effective for suicide prevention and stopping attempts or death by suicide is relatively new compared to depression and PTSD. And so I think that plays a role. The other thing is that I think the statistic is it takes on average 17 years from a research idea to go into practice after, clinical trials and vetting that type of intervention and then getting it into routine practice. And I think like routine practice and the way, practitioners and others kind of understand things also has a really important place in informing research. And so because it takes long and because it's relatively newer, the study like decades versus multiple decades. I think that maybe has yet to happen, but that perhaps we're on the cusp of being able to lay out some of that programmatic work and then test it.
Yeah, I mean, it's been around forever, and we could look back to it to kind of World War II with shell shock being post-traumatic stress, evolving into that. Our modern day shell shock is traumatic brain injury. It's TBI, right? So something that's been around since the dawn of time here, but we need to really spotlight it. I think that's what we're starting to see, the interwoven connection towards how they all play a part. So I'm always interested in that three-pronged approach here, or multifaceted approach. So let's talk about the split second, right? And when I say split second in suicide, there's a window, right, of a heightened sense of, like, for instance, when we talk about locking up our gun safe, right, our gun in a safe, by the time it takes to put that combination in, sometimes those suicidal ideations go away. Are you familiar?
Yes.
Am I making sense? What is that window, and what's going on in the mind?
Yeah. So a lot of the data that we understand, right, about suicide risk and moving from thoughts or risk to attempts and then tragically death by suicide, especially with firearms, is that window of decision making is very short. And we didn't understand it that way previously. And I think that what that allows us to do is think about what might be important and effective ways of intervening with people, right? So thinking about strategies and tools that they can use at 2 a.m. when there might not be anyone else around. Teaching those types of tools, having some kind of prevention activities or planning ahead of time, because the risk does shift very rapidly for people, once they're in crisis.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic, especially that point. I think everyone at this table's unfortunately encountered more than one person who's tragically died by suicide. And I'm gonna try and take an approach, and I appreciate you. So I'm gonna try and make it a point to say that from now on, died by suicide. But I think it's important to know that that those timeframes are small, and they're the concise timeframes are important, I guess, as well, right? So finding a way to intervene in an appropriate manner as well. It's hard to put the onus on the person as well, who's in that position. We constantly say, reach out if you need anything, reach out if you need anything. You can always call me. But how often do people actually take advantage of that, right? Very few of us have anyone that we can truly call in a moment like that. I'm lucky enough to have a couple people in my life who I'm able to do that. If I'm in a very bad position, I can make that phone call. But there's a lot of people who don't. And so what type of resources, I guess, is Face the Fight pushing out there for people who might need something like that? Is there a community of aspect to this that people can reach out and start to learn from each other or interact with each other?
Yeah. Well, let me talk a little bit about Face the Fight, because I think that would be hopefully something interesting to share as I'm here. So Face the Fight is a initiative. It was developed or created by USAA Corporation with founding partners Reach Resilience and Endeavors Foundation, as well as the Humana Foundation. And Face the Fight is really charged with impacting veteran suicide, dramatically reducing the rate of veteran suicide. And I think, thinking about the inception of Face the Fight, there's a deep appreciation that there are many organizations, government, nonprofits who've been at this wicked problem for a long time and have done some really important good work in, supporting veterans with suicide risk. And there's more that's needed. And so the idea of Face the Fight is really based on 3 interlocking elements. I'll explain each of these. One is supporting a public awareness campaign. So this idea that we've already started talking about is, how do we help reduce the stigma? How do we help people who can and willing ask for help? And how do we send messages of encouragement? Some of that's done through social media. That's done through the Face the Fight Coalition. I think a really good example of that is Walmart, who is a Face the Fight Coalition member, developed with Face the Fight these encouragement booths at different events. And the idea was that anyone who is at these events can come record a message of hope or support. And then this collection of messages, which ended up being really diverse, has been shared with the Face the Fight Coalition and on social media and other opportunities. And I think, this is a great example of supporting public awareness and thinking about, when veterans or anyone are experiencing suicide risk, even having, moments where it changes kind of that period of time that you're talking about, that risk period, from moving from ideation to action, thinking about offsetting that kind of downward spiral, if you will, that can be really effective in hearing messages of support and hope and kind of changing or shifting even momentarily the emotions that one might experience.
This is actually where the service dogs fit in as well. That split second to take to pet your dog who comes up just totally diminishes those thoughts. So that's another example of the power of service dogs. Something that I've seen firsthand. I'm sure you've seen countless examples of stories being shared as well from that. So you're on phase 1, right? Is that or is that all your phases?
Oh yeah, sorry. So that is the first component.
Exactly. So I wanted to pause you before
Sure.
phase 2 here and say, what are some other examples? Because that's very, very curious. On the Walmart piece, I didn't know that, and I think that's highly impressive. I think Walmart gets a lot of crap, but they also have a huge community impact program. But what are some other examples that you've seen of how to educate the public?
Yeah, I think it also, some of the work that Face the Fight has done in this domain of raising awareness is also raising awareness of things that work. So, I think it's, for me and for many people, it's very easy to feel kind of despondent about this challenge of suicide prevention for veterans. It's like,
Absolutely.
it's really hard. And, having, many of us, without knowing either of you well, would imagine that this has affected many of us deeply and personally. And so I think that, thinking about ways to share what we know is effective and sharing this idea that everyone plays a role. Everyone can have an opportunity to help can be a message of hope too.
Yeah. Oh, please.
I was just going to say, so we talked about booths, we talked about service dogs, we talked about gun safes. Give me your top 3 most effective tools that you are sharing right now on that maybe the average person doesn't know.
Yeah. So I think that things like a crisis response plan, or, sometimes you hear that term as a safety plan, which is essentially a developed set of strategies to help someone when they start to get into that crisis. It's hard to think through those strategies in times of crisis. Our brains start to go offline, our emotions raise. And so if you can develop a very specific plan ahead of time, research tells us that that's really helpful in preventing suicide attempts. And doing that with someone who's trained in that, who knows the structure of that's most effective, who can help resolve barriers and help a person be really specific, can be even more meaningful. And that helper does not have to be clinical. Can be.
Could be anybody, though.
But it could be anybody. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. I think what you're saying is the right type of education is what the public needs. And this is what I'm hearing, at least. And you used the word earlier, despondent, and that kind of stood out to me. And, I'm open to talking about my interpretation of things. So pushing out the number all the time, right? 22 a day, 28 a day, 44 a day. We hear different numbers all the time. And I think the general public has a very good education that veterans are a high-risk suicide. And unfortunately, I think we've pushed too much on that part of the education and not enough onto what you are talking about here. Because you can ask anybody on the street, hey, how many veterans kill themselves every day? And pretty much anybody who's heard the number can answer that. And I'm sure most people could answer that number. But no one can answer, what do you do for those types of people? Or what do you do for somebody in that position when they're reaching out? And I think very few people can answer that. So I think what you're saying is very important, that we need to educate people appropriately and properly on how to intervene, how to be that ear if they need to be, and less about just pushing out the number that, hey, all these veterans are broken and they're going to kill themselves. Because that's more often what we hear. And if that's where the buck stops, or if that's where the conversation stops, then no one's going to put the time or energy or effort into trying to make an appropriate change anyways.
For sure. I love the way you just put that.
Well,
resonates for me.
You said it. I'm just repeating it. Yeah. No, I think it's important though, and I'm glad to see that there's a shift happening now, and people are taking that more seriously instead of just, here's your education, it's 22. Like, well, no, that's not education. That's a fact, and it's a fact that we can change hopefully.
For sure.
So that was phase 2, I guess?
Yeah, that's one. I would call them components.
Phase 1. We still have
complete.
complete.
It's one important element of Face the Fight. There's 2 others.
Well, that was phase 1, but I asked you for 3 examples.
Oh, that's
phase
right.
1.
Sorry.
So we have 2 to 3 to go then 2 to 3 to go on.
So that's 9 for the bad.
Yeah.
people.
Thank you for doing that math
1, 2. Okay. So crisis response plan, which is, by the way, it's a training that you offer these other organizations who come aboard.
For sure.
It's on my to-do list as well.
Awesome.
Bob gets mad at me all the time. He said, "Did you do it?" I said, "I haven't been home." So, it's a whole thing. Anyway, it is on the list of things to do. So important. You guys offer other training though as well. I think the firearm safety.
Yeah. I'll talk about our training at Face the Fight, the Training and Resource Center, where these are offered just about monthly. But then there's also some other really good work in this area. So, going back to this idea that because suicide risk can rapidly shift, like what you were talking about earlier, another really important way to think about intervening is putting time and space between a veteran or anyone and the most deadly ways of dying by suicide, which is firearms, right? So this is really important because, not surprisingly, suicide with firearms, right, is the most deadly. 90% of suicide attempts that happen with firearms result in death. And so if we think about putting time and space between a person and their firearm or firearms when they're in crisis or when crisis is starting, that can help with having a little bit more time to maybe contact someone, have more resources, go through a crisis response plan, have someone intervene in some way. It just gives us more time.
Yeah.
And so that's great. But having those conversations can be really tricky.
Yes.
And so we really think about training in ways to support individuals, veteran community supporters, peers, and clinicians, and helping them have a framework and a way to talk about this as a tool to then use. Because for many people, those conversations are hard. Whether you own firearms yourself or not, it's a hard conversation to have.
Yeah, and it's a split decision too. I have no problem sharing. Is once I got back and dealt with my injury and stuff, I of course had the gun under the pillow, right? And this wasn't a suicidal ideation or anything, but I woke up kind of in that experience of thinking that I was overseas, and I had my gun drawn, loaded, ready to go before I even kind of woke up to that reality. So for me, locking up my gun for a point in time was so important, because by the time I unlocked it or brought it out or chambered around, I had come to that reality of hey, you're not in danger here, calm it down. So it is just that split decision, that split second that could save a life, yourself included.
For sure. One of the programs that Face the Fight funds and also partners with is called Overwatch Project. Are you all familiar with that?
I'm not.
So Overwatch Project is providing education and training in securing firearms in times of acute stress, right? But planning to do so. And it really follows this model of friends don't let friends drink and drive. So this idea of convening service members, guard members, veterans, groups of people to think about, if you had a buddy who was at a party and was intoxicated, would you take their keys? I think we could all probably say at this point, hopefully, yes.
Yeah. Uber's cheap.
Yeah, right, exactly.
It's cheaper than a DUI or
Yes.
getting someone killed.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so it's the same idea. If you're kind of looking out for your friends and, someone is not doing so well, maybe they're not even saying, I'm feeling suicidal, but they're really not doing well. They have a lot of stress. They're having some relationship challenges at work or other things. Teaching to have that direct conversation and making a proactive plan. Hey, if things get worse, what's the plan? What are we going to do? What are the options here?
Yeah.
With the same idea of, we don't let friends drink and drive, really thinking about how can we help support saving lives in times of distress.
Sure.
And really taking a community approach versus it relying solely on that individual who is experiencing stress or risk.
How receptive are people to this conversation? Because I know for a fact, like sometimes we like to bury the approach in adventure therapies or other kind of systems in place. Are veterans very responsive to this, or are you finding, because there's a difference between senior leadership and like your E4s and belows, right? You're lower enlisted. These guys are like, oh, F that, I'm not going to ask for help, right? And if I do ask for help, veterans are a different thing. We talk about this in the military a lot, though. When you're in active duty or reserve or whatever, you go to your chain of command. You don't want to talk to them because you get fired. So, are you seeing that there's kind of a disparage between senior enlisted and lower enlisted?
Yeah. So the program has been working for a couple years. Casey Woods is the principal of this program. She does a lot of this work at Fort Cavazos, and there has been really positive approach to this program. Part of it is that they have a tagline, just effing ask.
Okay. Yeah.
So it is irreverent, in your face, right? Yeah. And really kind of drives this message of this is a really critical task.
Sure.
And I think that, she has, and we have seen a lot of support of that program.
That's good. I had the same question as Dave. I imagine there would be a tremendous amount of apprehension or pushback for people like, I'm not locking up my guns, this, that, or the other. But I think when you take the approach that you guys have taken, like you said, with that tagline, just effing ask, it puts it kind of in their court as well. Like it helps them to understand.
For sure.
And that's a real thing too. Just effing ask, because that's the hardest thing to do. But get over it, right? Just ask the question. Be direct.
It's tough because the mentality, that space, that mission critical time period. Oftentimes the survivors or those who have survived the individual who's died by suicide, they always think that it's such a selfish move. And the people that I've talked to that have attempted suicide or gone through that I've had thoughts myself. I know, we've all experienced these low moments. The thing is selfish is such a harsh word, because I think that it's internally you might feel selfless. I'm a burden to them. They'd be better off without me. So I think that when we say selfish, it really takes away from, and this is very controversial, an extremely courageous moment that they are feeling too. Is like, it takes courage. You talk to people that attempt, like, that takes commitment and courage that most people go their entire lives fearing death. So it's very controversial, but I wanted to talk about that because I think it's so important that those who survived it, why they're so selfish. Why can they do that? How can they do that? Well, you're in a different headspace, and unless you've been there, you're not going to understand.
Well, I guess it depends on your perspective, right? Because from their perspective, it could be selfless, but from an outsider's perspective, or from, like, if you're a family of that person, it is a selfish act ultimately. And you're right, it does take courage to cross that threshold. And while you might be in the mindset of, I'm doing a selfless thing right now because I'm a burden, ultimately, I think the act still is a selfish act, even though the mindset. And what I'm saying is, they're in the wrong mindset currently, right? If I'm doing this as a selfless thing, I'm a burden to other people, well, that's an incorrect mindset, and it's an incorrect form of selflessness that's masked through selfishness.
And it's perspective, right? I mean, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist at the end of the day.
Sure.
So my point is you're in the wrong mindset here, and how do you break down those walls and educate the public and saying, hey, listen, that's not what they're doing.
Yeah.
You know, they're not maliciously in that moment attacking you and saying, F these people. Like that's not what's going on. Is there is a biochemical response that is wrong in their body at the time, and it's not of ill intent or malicious in any way. Is my point. How do we educate the public?
I wonder if part of the paradigm shift is to really think about that anyone who is having suicidal thoughts or, in crisis is in a lot of pain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that pain can drive behaviors that wouldn't otherwise. Pain is horrible. No one wants to feel pain. Mm-hmm. And so it can be really understandable, not agreeing with, but, or approving of, but understanding, empathizing with. If someone's in pain, one possible solution for that, to end that pain, is to make a suicide attempt or die by suicide.
How do we recognize that pain?
Yeah.
So I mean, that's a question we've all asked ourselves if we're close in a world of someone who's died by suicide, is what could I have done? Why didn't I see this?
Yeah. Sometimes the signs are fairly obvious too, and we choose to ignore them or choose not to see them for what they are too, right?
Yeah.
Because that's also a possibility, I think.
I think that I don't have a great answer. I wish I did.
Yeah. That's one of the questions, right? That's what I think, as Christian's point, is what we should be talking about and trying to understand and educate the public with, not by giving them a number that, quite frankly, is completely inaccurate. 22 a day, which everybody could put, has spewed out themselves. And it's twice that, maybe more. When you look at the VA's rating on overdosing, it's not counted towards that as well. Yeah. So
it could be even higher. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if part of it is, I think about it in two ways. One is, by trying to reduce stigma, we're also thinking about like our personal one-on-one conversations and making this a culture change.
Yeah.
Can we ask how people are doing in a that we're not expecting I'm great answer, like that we're really saying, no, really, how are you doing?
Yeah.
That's a great point.
Are you feeling in crisis? Is there anything so stressful that is really hard to manage right now? How can I help?
But people don't want to listen to that. Like most of the time, right? There's people out there that you're going to run into. I think it's a rarity. I think people are really, into themselves and their problems. Whereas, we could talk about this in psychology, implicit versus explicit, right? Is if you're close to me, maybe I could ask you that. If I'm walking, at a Starbucks and I ask a barista, how you doing? No, how are you really doing? Ain't no one got time for that is what you're thinking at least. So yes, I think that those who care need to ask a little bit more, especially in your own social circles, and I practice this all the time too, is especially, when I'm on the go all the time. If I'm trying to be better at, like, when someone pops in my mind, just shoot a text, hey, you popped in my mind, I'm thinking about you. Do you, if you want to chat, let me know, right? And it's weird at first, but it gives an invitation for that. And I've had several times where the phone rings just right after the text message. Hey, it was funny because I'm having just such a tough week, and giving an invitation, I think, is the important part to that is, hey, I'm here for you, and I had a tough week myself, so you came through to my mind, and if you
just thinking about you,
I'm just thinking about you, and I think especially for men, that's really hard, and that's what we talk about all the time, is kind of breaking down those barriers of what masculinity really means. Is it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to say to someone is like, it's okay to feel nowadays, right? I mean, back in World War II, it was like rub some dirt on it, but that's not like that anymore, especially with us being so connected, but so disconnected at the same time because of these dang things, right? Mm-hmm. So asking for an invitation, I think that's really important. Giving an opportunity to speak about what's going on in your life is important. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
Maybe calling people on their shit too when they're lying.
Yeah. Good? Really?
Really? Good's not an emotion. Tell me how you're really feeling.
It reminds me of the Mel Gibson movie where he's like, hey, good morning. How do you know what goddamn day it is?
Yeah, exactly. That's the military. Well, we've started this little community, through various aspects. On Friday mornings, we host a workout with a group of veterans. We've got 15, 20 people who come out. It's open to whoever wants to come join us, and we've made it a point to create our little community in these little aspects. Through Terra Arma, our business, we have our Terra Arma Adventure Club. Once a month, we do a physical hike, workout, exercise of some sort with a group of people, get sweaty, and then we have an open conversation. Like, hey, this is what's on everyone's mind. How is everyone feeling this month? We bring up topics from previous months. I think it's important to form these little communities and to be open with each other. It's something that Dave and I we couldn't really find around here, so we made our own. Awesome. It's hard to find. It's hard to find like-minded people who want to have these conversations and they want to do things physically hard, and they want to better themselves, and they want to be there for other people and do the right thing. And now we're seeing this community come together. And if you can't find it, you got to make it. At the end of the day,
that's a great point too, Christian. It kind of marries our terminology together of asking for, like, opening an invitation, right? When this happens, this Terra Arma Adventure Club, we allow the invitation for people to say, hey, this is a safe spot. And then other organizations started coming in, right? We just did this hike with an organization here called Carry the Load. Where you're walking and you're hiking on pavement in 100-degree weather, by the way, but you are carrying someone with you that has fallen or died by suicide or whatever that close person that you're thinking about. And it was a great organization because I don't think if we didn't create something like that, we would have gotten connected to them. And then Soldiers Angels is another one. You've probably heard of them. So having an invitation just connects the dots when it comes to community, because there's a lot of this thoughts that go around, but where do they feel safe?
For sure. And so what you're describing is suicide protection.
Yeah.
Right? This idea that social support and community can protect against suicide risk.
I love that terminology. Suicidal protection.
Yeah. And there are opportunities sometimes, not always, but sometimes in these types of groups to do more suicide prevention. So things like a crisis response plan or have a meaningful, proactive conversation about lethal means. That, kind of that is that idea of more downstream intervention that can happen in these more protective environments, especially when you're building trust.
Sure. Absolutely. And it's important to build that trust in whether it's a small community or a large community. It's important to find people that you can talk to in a realistic manner, in my opinion. There's a lot of surface level relationships that we see these days. It's very based through social media, or it's limited to that range, and people aren't being nearly as open, or they're not able to. I think a lot of people they don't know how to be open. They don't know how to be in touch with their own emotions. That's why I'm a big proponent of CBT or CPT, right? Cognitive behavioral therapy, to learn your emotions. It's the first thing you do when you show up. They're like, all right, I'm going to show you the emotion wheel. Do you know what these words mean? And most people are like, that's a lot of emotions.
Yeah. 36, but I only had 3.
Yeah. Happy, sad, and hungry, right?
Angry, especially men. I have 2.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm fine or angry.
Yeah. But I think it's so important to be able to understand your own emotions. And we actually had this conversation with one of the guys at our Friday workout 2 weeks ago. We show up an hour beforehand to have conversation, and I brought up therapy. He's just gotten out of the military, and I was like, hey, have you thought about therapy? And his answer was, F no. Like, just right off the bat, knee-jerk reaction. I was like, really? He's like, yeah, that's lame. I would never do that. I'm like, oh, I've done all of them at the VA.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? He goes, oh, well, I didn't mean it like that. Like, well, let's talk about it. What do you think? What are your thoughts on it? How are you feeling right now? Let's talk about what I learned there. How are you feeling? Well, I'm good. Okay, well, good's not an emotion. Like, let's challenge that a little bit. And he took a step back. Like, oh, maybe I need to analyze my emotions and see how I'm feeling right now. And I don't know how to do that appropriately. Like, yeah, these are the things that you learn. It's not just go talk about your feelings.
For sure.
And a lot of people have this, like they have the TV psychologist aspect of it where you lay down on the couch and talk about your feelings and everything's sweet. It's not always like that. It's very direct sometimes. Hey, we're going to educate you today. I'm going to talk about something very important today and let's move on. Let's try to get you better. I think a lot of people just have a weird misconception about it, but...
And there's different, I think, different modalities is really important too. Is I like to talk about. So especially when I just joined the Robert Irvine Foundation, I despised adventure therapy. I really did, and it was because I was underwriting grants for organizations that I thought were people trying to pay for free vacation. This is about 11, 12 years ago. So it was my lack of education on that as well, where I said, you know what, I'm going to give it a shot. I'm going to go not participate, but be an observer of these programs. As an employee of the Robert Irvine Foundation, not as a veteran myself. I just want to watch. I want to observe, and I noticed something very interesting. Is that one of the first ones I went to was on a deep sea fishing trip. I just sat on the boat and I just watched the veterans interact. And what I noticed was no one talked. No one said anything. I said, see, I know, look, these guys are just fishing. They're just trying to get a free fishing trip out of it. And then they started talking. They had a meal as they're doing their thing. And then I noticed that the focus was just so onto what they're doing. The first veteran who spoke said, I didn't even think about my worries. I was so tuned in. This was the first time I fished. And then you started unlocking the conversations after that. Like he mentioned here, we have a hike coming up as well on the Robert Irvine Foundation. And it's a 54-mile hike in the Scottish Highlands. And I've done it for 11 years as a mentor for the program. And what I've noticed is right around mile 7, everybody's real quiet. They're getting into the hike, and then they start talking. And in my experience, it's doing something that sucks together. It's doing something that's hyper focused together. And that's when the therapy really starts happening. So instead of shoving it down your face, sometimes some people need to be in those modalities.
Yeah. Put in a weird box
For
or
sure.
outside of the box.
And not all veterans seek mental health care, like the example you were
Not
giving,
enough.
Christian. Yeah. And there's lots of different reasons why. Maybe it's about readiness, maybe it's about access. And so equipping, equipping, peers and friends and, people doing things together, like what you're describing, equipping them with tools that we know are effective and work for suicide prevention is a really important place to help untangle this wicked problem. And so, with Face the Fight, another kind of component, right? I talked about public awareness campaign. There's the coalition itself, which I'll get to here. And then there's also our philanthropic grant making. And that has really been focused on helping to increase access to these things that we know that are most effective based on the data that we have currently. It's not to say that other things won't be more effective in the future. We just don't have the testing yet. But what we know is effective now, and really getting them out as many places as we can across the country. So since Face the Fight has begun, there's been 30 projects that have been funded across different sectors. One focus is in increasing access to good quality clinical care through funding organizations that are veteran service organizations that provide clinical care, places like Centerstone Military Services, the Headstrong Project, Cohen Veterans Network, Stop Soldier Suicide. But also really thinking about what are community organizations or organizations with a suicide protection mission that have the opportunity to train their employees or scale or support these types of interventions, even if it's not their core mission.
Sure.
And I think Robert Irving Foundation is a great example of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what does the future look like for suicide prevention? And, like Dave mentioned earlier, we've talked to maybe 200 people at this point, relative to topics around mental health and associating fields.
Just on this show, by the
Yeah,
way,
just
not
on-
in interactions with the Robert Irvine Foundation or our personal lives. Just on
any
this
of the
show.
other things that we do, yeah. But obviously, there's a lot of different modalities coming out. Transcranial magnetic stimulation on the TBI side, psychedelics is making a huge push. And I know there's apprehension within a lot of established organizations, understandably so, about not necessarily adopting the treatment, but it seems like people are being a lot more receptive to at least looking at it now, because when you have 5,000-10,000 anecdotal cases, it starts to become data, right? And I'm curious, what does the future look like? What's cutting edge right now? Because we've talked to a lot of people, whether it's on the psychedelic front or these odd contraptions that they're making. There's a company called HAPBee right now. Are you guys familiar with this? HAPBEE. So it's a magnetic stimulation device you wear around your neck, and it simulates the electron cloud structure of chemicals, and it passes those magnetic waves through your brain to replicate compounds that you can take. So it'll do things like THC or CBD or caffeine or theanine, and it'll put your brain into a weird state without having to actually consume these chemicals. So there's a lot of really interesting things, and I'm curious what you guys are seeing, or if you're talking to people on the cutting edge piece.
Yeah, I think that, the way I think about it is more evidence-informed and evidence-based interventions and tools that we have, the better. Because not everyone does the same thing, and there isn't one fit for everyone. We know that there are certain things that work, that are effective, and as that data gets actualized, right, and published, we want to pay attention to that and see what else is there an opportunity to support veterans and support suicide prevention. The thing that gives me pause is, this idea that we've been talking about, that not all veterans seek clinical care. And perhaps if there was a variance in the types of clinical care or opportunities, right, or these types of interventions are positioned differently, that could kind of change that access to care issue. But there's lots of reasons that a veteran might not seek clinical care. And so I think we also really have to think about what can we do in community settings. And, some of these innovations there might not be an opportunity to set up and to, have all the equipment and the monitoring that you need.
Yes.
And so I say, I hope there are, 1,001 things we can do for veteran suicide prevention in the future. I think we just really have to think about the where and the how, and that's an important piece.
Yeah, the exposure, right? A lot of guys or folks, as they're transitioning out of the military, the last thing they want to do is go to all those classes and the TAPS and the yellow ribbon and this and that and the other. And it's a lot of boring conferences and people speaking. There's a lot of really good information there, though. And I think we can take a lot of this, I think a lot of these different approaches as well, and I think they should be made available to transitioning veterans as they're getting out. Like, hey, you have to go check this out, and just sit down with them for a few minutes. Try this device out, or try this therapy out, or whatever it is. Just get them a little bit exposed to it. If they can see just a touch of progress, they might be more inclined to come back and give it a shot. Because a lot of people are just like, that's lame. I don't even want to put the time in. I'm not even going to try. And that's it's unfortunate to see that. But
I think it all stems back to education. We talk about all of these different systems and devices and modalities that are coming out here, and we always have to be cautious of the next miracle tonic, right? I mean,
Snake oil.
there's exactly you pay $2,500 here for an alpha stem, you pay for this new HAB device, $1,500, whatever it is, and then all of a sudden you have people that are just taking advantage of the mental health crisis in this country. Period. It really is. So, kind of last thing that I wanted to mention here, and I know you have the third stage.
You're tracking, yeah.
Right, to go over here, but is exactly that, is education for all of these opportunities that are tried, vetted, and true, right? So let's talk about the third stage of kind of, we go over the crisis response, like face the fight, right?
Yeah. So the other the other component of Face the Fight, I talked about public awareness campaign and grant making to increase access, and is the coalition itself. And the coalition is over 200 really diverse organizations, nonprofits, veteran service organizations, government liaisons, corporations, with this idea that the sum is more than the parts, and that cross-sector collaboration can drive new innovation and support.
Yeah, beautiful.
And I think that is something that I, as a supporter of Face the Fight, as a strategic partner in my role at UC Health San Antonio, have been really impressed by. I think a great example of this is VA has a program called Buddy Check, and the idea is, it was in October this past year, is to really garner thinking about this importance of connection and community, and having veterans pledge in a short period of time, I pledge to contact 10 other veterans or friends or people I care about. And so Face the Fight, along with Starbucks, who's a coalition member, had the opportunity to partner with VA. And, where do we think about some of these connection conversations happening? Getting coffee, coffee at Starbucks. And so Starbucks, as part of this to help amplify, offered 10,000 Starbucks gift cards to the first 10,000 veterans who signed up for the VA Buddy Check program.
Nice.
And in the first 36 hours of this, over 10,000 had signed up.
That's awesome.
And I think it's one of the, kind of most successful, if not the most successful or quickest Buddy Check signups that they've had.
Yeah, very cool.
So I think that's a great example of cross-sector collaboration, and Face the Fight really trying to convene that as much as possible.
That's beautiful. I think we talk about this too, on the business side of things. And I just got back from a fabulous program called DAV Patriot Boot Camp, where we mentor veteran entrepreneurs who are coming in to talk about their business. And some of them have no idea, some of them have a plan. But collaboration versus competition. And when I see nonprofits get into that for-profit mentality of competition versus collaboration, one of the things that's so great about this program and Face the Fight initiative is you do have 200 organizations that all are subject matter experts in a field that they're saying, hey, let's strengthen up our weaknesses here. Let's work together. Let's not take credit. And that's the problem, I think, with some of, we could go all day about societal issues here. But when we get in the mindset of helping ourselves versus helping other people, it becomes detrimental to the mission. So collaboration is so important to understand that not every nonprofit could do everything. It needs other organizations to thrive and to get the messages out there. So I really love that aspect, and I just wanted to double down on that point: is collaboration versus competition.
Yeah, that terminology makes a lot of sense to me, and I think it's hard. Organizations get siloed, and there's limited funding, and there's all these kind of barriers potentially. And really, the goal of the Face the Fight Coalition is to break down some of those barriers, because we're all wanting the same thing: to prevent veteran suicide.
Yeah. And it's going to take powerful, huge organizations like USAA who say, hey, here's this funding. Let's split it up against amongst the people who are doing the right thing. So that's my call to action to our audience all the time is support organizations, nonprofits out there, because they are bridging the gap between what the VA and active duty reserves are doing for our guys at the end of the day. Is we no longer, we're seeing recruitment's going up, but we're seeing people don't want to join the military anymore because of how they were treated after, right? Yeah. During, you get all the training in the world, but what are we learning? It's almost like we're chewed up and spit out at the end of the day. So it's the nonprofits that are saving lives. So I just want to thank you for coming on and talking about what you guys do here. Is there anything that you wanted to add or we kind of missed about Face the Fight?
I would say that, if anyone who is interested in learning more and, thinking about your role as an individual, as a peer, helping and supporting others. They are these no-cost trainings that Face the Fight offers in crisis response planning, in, supporting these conversations about securing firearms in times of crisis. And so you can go to wefacethefight.org to get access to learning about and signing up more.
Beautiful. Yeah. Beautiful. And for all our listeners as well, if you go to robertirvinefoundation.org, there is information on Face the Fight. We got ourselves a subject matter expert, Robert Yarnell, as well, that you could always reach out to. So thank you for being on the show today and telling us about a difficult conversation to talk about, but we need to do it more. We need to educate those around us. So thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you very much. This has been the Medevac podcast, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for watching. If you haven't already, interact with the show somehow. Please leave a review. We would love you very much. Anyways, we'll see you next week.
See you next time.
Bye.